This is the 5th Sunday in the season of Epiphany. And a few weeks ago, Annie did our children's time, and she drew this for the children, the Epiphany moment. Her context was cartoons, and I certainly related to cartoons. And we are going to study a different kind of an epiphany today. There are 2 more Sundays in the season of Epiphany. As I studied for this, I became more aware that the days were getting longer. There is more light in the day. And what a blessing. What a welcome thing, those lengthening days. My sister-in-law is here, and we are avid gardeners, so Kim and I are looking out there in the yard to see what is living and what is growing and what's possible out there with all of that increased light. Okay, so before I start and go too far, I would like to thank Tim and thank Charlie for the opportunity to be here in the pulpit today. We have had a vast host of really terrific proclaimers during this interim, and I wanted to say how honored I am to be included in that number. I wanted you to know how thankful Carrie and I are for Charlie, for Tim, for Stephanie, for Dr. George Mason, for Dr. Stephen Cady, who has been here, for Josh and Annie that have ministered to us so brilliantly. And I hope you will take the opportunity to thank them as well. Barbara Brown Taylor, who died at the end of the year last year, and I didn't know that till I started studying for this sermon, used to say that the act and the art of proclamation are like taking your hands, if you were the proclaimer, and sticking them up into lightning. Sticking your hands up into lightning and then explaining to people what that means. And I thought that if I stuck my hands up into lightning, would that be the case for me? And so I don't know that I will be as dazzling as Charlie is with these words, but they're a wonderful lesson, and I hope you'll take the boat trip and the fishing trip with me. When I was a child, we lived in New Orleans for 6 years, and on Saturday, my mom needed a break from me and my brother, okay? And so that meant we were Dad's property on Saturday. Now, times have changed. A dad today would take a child to do what the child wanted to do. My dad was old school. You were on his agenda. And for the 5 or 6 years that we lived in New Orleans, that meant you went fishing on Saturday morning. You got up in the dark. You got a scrambled egg sandwich that you ate in the car, and we drove off to go fishing. Okay, so I get car sick, I get seasick, I get sunburned, and if you ever want to know who it was that was rocking the boat, well, that would have been me, okay? And so I am not the world's greatest natural fisherman. But the truly deplorable thing about my fishing, Lindy, is I don't touch worms. I don't put them on hooks. And so my dad would give me a net, okay, no hooks, no worms, a net, and I would just lower my net off the side of the boat. I would let it sit there for a couple of hours, and then I would pull it up, look at every wonderful thing that was in there, and set it free. That's the kind of fisherman I am. Okay, so for us, Fishing was just sort of a way to spend a Saturday with Dad. Not so in our text today. We're in chapter 5. Dr. Mason finished up at the end of chapter 4 a couple of weeks ago, and a couple of things happened. Jesus announced who he was in his hometown synagogue of Nazareth, and that was not welcome news. The other thing that happened in chapter 4 is that Jesus heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law of a fever. Okay? And the other thing that happens at the end of chapter 4 is Jesus is engaged in a lot of healing and casting out of demons. So when chapter 5 comes along, Jesus is not in the synagogue. He is not in the hushed and reverent tones of a synagogue. There's no attendant with scriptures. He is out walking along the shore of Lake Gennesaret or the Sea of Galilee, however you want to call it. And people are crowding in around him. And they're clamoring for him to teach the word of God. There is a hunger for the preaching of the word. And the longer Jesus walks, the bigger the crowd is following behind him. And it begins to press in on him so much that he decides he's going to have to find a way to teach them. So he was watching fishermen clean their nets. And I think Lindy probably had a picture of what I found on the internet. At the end of nighttime fishing, those fishermen would have fished with something called a trammel net, okay? And it came in sections, and you would make like a wall of fishing net. It was multiple layers. It was probably made out of flax, and it was very thick. And so at the end of a night's fishing, they would come ashore, disassemble the individual trammel nets, and wash them and put them back in the boat for fishing the next night. Okay, so if you are in need of a trammel net, you can go to Memphis Net and Twine, find purveyors of trammel nets for all of your fishing needs, and you can buy a trammel net today. They come in different sizes, they come in different weights, but a trammel net is still very much with us today. So Jesus is watching these fishermen who caught nothing that night clean these individual sections of trammel nets to put them back in the boat. You would never, ever use a trammel net to fish during the day because fish can see a net that thick and that long. It was a night fishing tool. So Jesus decides that he's going to have to teach this crowd, and never one to be shy about asking for what he needs. Jesus just sort of steps onto Simon Peter's boat and says, "Peter, can you help me? I need your help." And I think it is not a ploy. I think Jesus genuinely needs Peter's assistance in this situation. What Jesus has decided to do is push out away from the shore and use Peter's fishing boat as a pulpit. Okay, the problem with a body of water that big is if you don't have somebody really skilled rowing and holding the boat in place, you're going to be preaching as you drift away from your crowd. So Jesus enlists Peter's help, and sure enough, they push out away from the shore, get out a distance, and Jesus addresses the crowd. And he teaches them. He sits down to teach the Hebrew position of teaching authority. And when the teaching concludes, you and I would have expected to have Peter row Jesus back to shore, Jesus hop off the way he hopped on, and be on his way to do whatever it was Jesus was doing that day. But Jesus says to Peter, let's head out to the deep water. Let's head out to the deep water. And let's take another run at this fishing. Okay? And I say that to you so gently and so diplomatically that you could not possibly be offended. But I would have loved to have seen the look on Peter's face, right? The man who was frequently wrong but never in doubt. Okay? Here is this landlubber from the hilly part of Nazareth, the landlubber from the north of Nazareth, come to tell the seasoned fishing captain, let's go give this another shot. And so sure enough, they push out into deep water. And I think in Peter's mind, he thought, this is going to be such a humiliation for Jesus. This is my world. This is not his world. Okay? I know fishing. We are out on this lake at the wrong time of the day. Okay? It's not nighttime. Fishermen in the Sea of Galilee or Lake Gennesaret, whichever term you're comfortable with, they fish at night for one simple reason. That's when the fish come out to eat. Okay, in the Sea of Galilee or Lake Gennesaret, it is fed by springs and brooks that feed into this. And where they feed in to the big body of water is very oxygen rich. And that's where the fish are. So Jesus, the landlubber, has told the experienced sea captain, we're going to head out to the place where there's no fish, and we're going to head out to the place with the wrong equipment, and we're going to head out to the place where no fish are. I bet Peter was furious, probably only happy in the thought that he was going to prove Jesus wrong and show his experience as a sea captain. But the miraculous catch happens, okay? They push out to deep water where there should have been no fish. And they catch this miraculous catch of fish. In the reading, it says that Peter says to Jesus, "Teacher," or Lord. And that is a translation from the Greek word epistates. Epistates. And y'all don't tell Charlie that I said Greek words by myself with pronunciations from the internet. Epistates, okay? In most biblical translations that you read, it's going to say master, teacher. But it's also translated boss, chief. Okay, so let's think about the hot-headed Peter in dispute about his job here. The Kathleen Campbell paraphrase of that would be, Peter looks at Jesus and says, okay, boss, let's just get out here in the lake and see who is who and what is what about the fishing. Okay, chief, who knows what's going on here? Can you feel a resonance with that translation, with that idea of Peter's superiority? Okay, let me ask you a question a little closer to home. Have you ever thought that you knew better than God? Have you ever thought that you knew better than God? I have. And so I think that Peter isn't exactly insulting to Jesus, but I don't think it's what your Bible translates like this idea that I was taught through the years, that Peter just took one look at Jesus and said, Master. I think at this point in the story, Peter is still pretty much counting on his own expertise, the way that you and I count on our own expertise when we're going to deal with God. So they catch these fish. It is a boat swamping, net tearing kind of a catch. In my family, like I said, fishing was just sort of a hobby and a way to pass the day. Not so in this setting. Fishing was big business. This is what they did for a living. And a catch of that size and of that nature would have made you rich. And a couple of weeks fishing with that kind of a catch would have set you up for years and years to come. And I think you can look into Peter's face and hear his words and think what I would have thought in Peter's place. We're gonna be rich, boys. We're gonna be rich. The ship has come in. Those fishermen's dreams have come true. And then I think Peter looked at Jesus and thought, if he has this kind of knowledge about how to fish on this lake, why is he a penniless, wandering rabbi? We're not talking about a small amount of change making successful fishing. We're talking about a lot of money. And Peter begins to think in his mind, what kind of person is this that would choose God and people over wealth? What kind of person is this? And so I think the Epiphany, and here's our graphic demonstration of the Epiphany moment. Okay, here is our Epiphany moment. It occurs to Peter that there might be something bigger and better and grander outside his own understanding. And as Lindy read, it was a sobering thought for Peter. I don't know how to deal with such a different value system. And so you have to give Jesus credit in the sense you and I have spent an entire life in church saying to each other that Jesus was a fisher of men. And for those of us, who participate in any kind of mission or any kind of outreach from the church, we hope that we are fishers of men, that we bring people to love and to faith in Jesus. But I think Jesus has caught himself a big one. He caught Peter. And Peter says at the end of the passage, let me find this, hold on. Peter says at the end of the passage, go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. Go away from me, Lord. Okay, gone is the epistates kind of take on it or twist on it. This Greek word is the word Kyrios. If you sing in choir, sometimes you sing Kyrie, an address of how we address the Lord in very holy terms. But the Greek word kyrios is interesting in the sense that its roots are secular. It's not a word that came from within the church or within the Christian movement. Its roots were political. Jesus is Lord in this setting at this time is a very political statement. And what it says is that Jesus is the King of kings. He is a king's king. He is king of the matter. He is Lord of all. It's a much more powerful, sweeping, encompassing statement than where he started out at the beginning of the story. And Jesus affirms Peter in the sense that he doesn't say, okay, Peter, you are a seasoned fisherman, but now you're going to sell insurance for me. Okay? He meets Peter where he is and uses the skills that Peter has. All right, so by and large, 90% of the time, I am a Sunday school teacher. And I have just taught you a really good Sunday school lesson about this passage. But my task here today is bigger than teach you about Peter and Jesus and epistates and kyrios. The proclamation, the lightning part comes now. What does it mean to you? How do you live in light of Jesus' actions here? Okay, so years ago, Carrie and I had a little dog that was just a bundle of energy. And you had to walk her every day or she wasn't worth living with. And there's a park at the end of our block. And there used to be a team of little girls that played soccer. And they were 4 or 5. They could not have been any older than 6. And they had a coach, Lindy, that had a big shiny silver whistle. And he would set up orange cones for them to run drills with. And he had a clipboard. And he would say to them, all right, girls, tell me, what are we? And they would screw up their tiny little faces and they would say, we're piranhas. And he would say, that's right, girls. And what are we going to do? Kill them. We're going to kill them. Okay? And he would run scrimmages and he would say, okay, girls, face off. Drive the ball on each other. And those little girls would walk up to each other, Susie, and they would look at each other and say, I like your hair. And then the other one would say, I like your shoes. And he would blow his whistle and say, no, no, girls, scrimmage. And they would not. For years, I thought that man was the most ridiculous, out-of-touch person that I have ever known. How could you ask tiny little piranha to do the things that he wanted to do? I thought about the piranha when I studied to teach this lesson, and I think I sold the coach short. I do. I thought of the piranhas. None of them, Tim, ever became a mighty striker of the ball. I'm pretty sure they didn't make the Olympic team. When the piranhas would practice, there were no parents there. No lawn chairs, no older brothers, no older sisters. It was just the piranhas and the coach and me and the dog. It obviously wasn't the season that they hoped for because they never showed up again. But I thought about that coach when I studied this week and how much I should have thought of him the way that Jesus saw Peter in that boat that day. Was he horribly wrong? No. Was he everything he could have been? No. And neither are you, and neither are me. Neither am I. If the first time you encounter Jesus, you don't fall down and say, Master, or fall down and say, Lord, because you didn't understand and you couldn't fully believe, you're in good company. And God bless Peter, and he will bless you in that faith. All right, the last story I'm going to tell you is a story about Carrie and I not long after we got married. Ronald Reagan was president. Mikhail Gorbachev was the head of the Soviet Union. And we used to have what we called the Cold War. I don't know if anybody remembers the Cold War except me and Carrie, but it was a global battle, okay? So there was no internet, young people. There was no internet. And we would just look for glimpses of this idea and culture that was completely different than our own. Okay, so there was the Soviet idea, and there was the American idea, and those ideas clashed across the globe. And we would look for, we would look for when the Olympics came, we would scan the faces of those Russian Olympic team members and say, well, they don't look that well. They don't look that healthy. Those American athletes, they look much better than that. And we would argue over military hardware, who had the bigger fighter jet, who had the best tanks and armaments. And so my husband's best friend David is here from New York City, and David and Carrie engage in a game of who can buy the most obscure Christmas present, one for the other. And young people, back in the day when Ronald Reagan was president, there was a thing called a bookstore, okay? A bookstore. And so we would go out to eat on Friday night, Carrie and I, and we would go to the bookstore and buy a book or a magazine. And so Carrie was so delighted when he found in the back reaches of the bookstore a magazine subscription for something called Soviet Life. And Carrie was delighted. Okay, so he sends David a subscription to the Soviet Life magazine. And I was furious with Carrie. I was like, Carrie, there is now a satellite in geosynchronous orbit over our house, and the CIA knows our name because we're buying Soviet propaganda. Thank you for that. And so David decides that he will try and find something in a similar vein, but he has a much richer hunting ground because he lives in New York City. So David goes into the bookstore that's not the one that he was looking for, but another one, and asks this man, Kitty, that looked like Fidel Castro, right, with this cigarette and the ashes hanging down. And David asks him, do you have something similar to Soviet life? And the man snapped back at David and said, we are not revisionist. We are revolutionary. We are not revisionist, the hopeful remaking of what exists. We are revolutionary. And I thought about that story too this week because would you know the revolution if you saw it? Jesus took a man in a boat who was thrown out of the synagogue. Okay, he was thrown out of a crowd of people that should have known who he was and why he was there, and they couldn't recognize him, and they didn't know him. And thus began the very revolution that saved us all. We're not revisionist. We come here good and kind-hearted people, but what we engage in is revolution. Okay, that's it for me today.